Starting to like.
I think we are ready to go, and welcome everybody to the dozens, if not hundreds, of people tuning in. Welcome to Crafts in Your Kitchen, a virtual beer tasting. I'm Tim Eby. I'm the general manager at St. Louis Public Radio and very much a craft beer enthusiast. And I'll be guiding you through this program this evening as we enjoy tasting and learning the science and stories behind the beer selections that are chosen by our special guests. It's really great to see everybody here. Before we get going, I want to go through a few housekeeping measures so everybody is aware of how we're handling this tonight. First of all, this is an event from the Alumni Association of UMSL. Now, if you have any issues tonight from a technical standpoint, there's the email address that you can email. We'll have folks standing by watching email in case you have any issues with your Zoom technical capabilities. That's executiveevents@umsl.edu. So very easy if you have any issues. Hopefully you won't. Just don't spill any beer on your computer. Big deal there. We are going to use the chat feature for communicating tonight. And so you can ask questions and communicate with our panelists and attendees with the Zoom feature that we have. It's being monitored by our events team that's producing this event with us. And let's, of course, remember the rules. And as an UMSL community, let's support one another. Let's be respectful of everyone here. Let's keep it positive and on topic. And obviously, no trolling or cyberbullying. And certainly do not steal someone else's beer. That's important. So let's keep those rules going. So we're also going to do this thing called a poll throughout the evening to kind of get your feedback on this. And so it's going to be fun. The poll question will pop up on your screen. And you may have to put your beer down to answer, but select your answer, click submit, and then we'll share the results and display, and we'll discuss some of these things. So this will be fun to do these polls before and after the beers. So that's going to be ahead for us as well. And please do post your pictures on social media at UMSL Alumni and hashtag UMSL Alumni on Facebook, Twitter, and on Instagram as well. So this is going to be great fun. And so I encourage you to get involved, interact with us on this. This is the first time event for the UMSL Alumni Association, and so it's going to be a whole lot of fun as we get through this. But please share this, share the enthusiasm that we all have over great beer and the University of Missouri St. Louis. So let's get started, and I want to introduce you to our guests that are with us this evening. We have a great panel for us, and I want to first introduce Bruce Hamper. Dr. Hamper, we can call him the Doctor of Beer if you want. Dr. Hamper received his BA from Kalamazoo College and his PhD from the University of Illinois Urbana. He began working with Monsanto in St. Louis and later joined G.D. Searle to pursue discovery medicinal chemistry. And we'll find out what that means with beer in just a few minutes, I'm sure. This led to research assignments at Pharmacia and Pfizer following a number of industry mergers and acquisitions. And in 2010, he joined the faculty at UMSL and is now an associate teaching professor at UMSL. And among the many courses that he teaches at UMSL is beer brewing, chemical and biochemical principles. Bruce, welcome.
Thank you, Tim. That's wonderful. And I invite anyone to, of course, enroll in the class. You can do that even if you're an alumni. You can enroll in the class and have some fun with us at UMSL. Come back and visit.
Absolutely. One of our brewers is Derrick Langeneckert from Alpha Brewing. He's the owner and head brewer at Alpha, which he founded in 2011. He's a graduate of Drake University, where he earned a BS in biochemistry, cellular and molecular biology, and from UMSL, the University of Missouri St. Louis, where he earned a master's in biology in 2016. Welcome, Derrick.
Cheers.
And you're enjoying the outside today, so that's perfect. And we also want to welcome Brian Owens. Brian is the Chief Brewing Officer at O'Fallon Brewery, a position that he's held since 2002. 18 years of brewing at O'Fallon, and that's the same year that he earned his BSBA in marketing from UMSL. Additionally, Brian earned a certificate in brewing and packing from Chicago's Siebel Institute and Guild of Brewing. Did I get that name right? Okay.
You did.
Okay, great. And Brian, welcome. Also, finally, I want to thank our hosts and the creators of this event, the UMSL Office of Alumni Engagement, the UMSL Alumni Association, and UMSL Executive Events. So guess what? Let's start talking beer, and let's start with our very first beer. Now, are we gonna do the poll right here to start things off? There we go. There's the poll. So here's the question: have you ever tried any beer from tonight's breweries before? Question, answer, and submit. And we can, as the votes are being tabulated, why don't we get going on our first beer? And there's some votes. O'Fallon has had 43, both 31. So we have some beer enthusiasts here and some folks who have never tried either of these beers until tonight. So that's going to be great to introduce you to this. So this is going to be fun. So let's start with our first beer from O'Fallon and a pale ale. And Brian, we'll let you kick it off, talk a little bit about this beer, and we'll get Bruce to chime in and we'll talk about it. So Brian, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Super excited to be here, and it's time to crack our first beer. So I'm gonna open this 3.3 pale ale with you guys, if you haven't done it already, and pour it into whatever receptacle you feel comfortable with. There are, always glasses that are specifically designed for drinking certain styles of beer. I've never been super particular about that myself. Tonight I'm drinking mine out of a stemless wine glass, which I feel is appropriate for most any beer. Our 3.3 pale ale, first I say cheers and drink with you guys.
Cheers.
So the whole idea behind the 3.3 pale ale is to create, there's a lot of popularity around low alcohol beers these days. And so we wanted to create something that kind of hit that target with low alcohol, but still packed with enough flavor to make it taste like a fuller bodied beer. So we did that in a lot of different ways. It is a pale ale, so it's going to be a little more hop forward. There are a couple unique things that you'll see and taste and smell in this beer. One of them is a hop called Sultana, which is a relatively new hop, a lot of tropical pineapple characteristics. And so what we did with the hops in this beer, and Derrick probably does a couple of these beers as well, is we burst hopped this beer. So when we talk about, and Bruce can kind of explain a little bit of the brewing process as well, but when we talk about adding hops to beer, the later in the process that you add the hops, the more flavor and aroma you get. Typically, you would add bittering hops and some flavor hops, and then some aroma hops at the end. Well, with burst hopping, we added all of the hops at the back end. So we really wanted to get that big aroma characteristic without a lot of bitterness. So, this beer comes in at 15 IBUs. And IBUs, for those that don't know, and Bruce can explain as well, is a scale, an international bittering scale. It goes from 0 to 100. So for 15, it's a relatively low on the bitterness, but the hop characteristics pretty much jump out on the nose of this beer. The other unique characteristic that you'll find is a malt that we use in this beer called blonde roasted oats. So it has a really strong cereal type character. You get a lot of that kind of mouthfeel and oat character from this malt. And the whole idea was to build up the mouthfeel in the body a little bit. Since the alcohol is at 3.3%, alcohol adds a lot of that mouthfeel. So as you take the alcohol down, we wanted to build in some other ingredients to help bring that mouthfeel back up to what would be considered more of a normal, full-flavored beer. So, it's polarizing, I think, because it has that oat character. It has that unique tropical pineapple Sultana hop character, but it's super easy to drink, and yet it still has all those hops in the back end.
Brian, how long have you been making this beer?
We just came out with it this year. So I'll tell you that this beer, everyone should go out and try it, but it's going to be difficult to find with everything going on with the COVID over the last couple of months. It's difficult to get new SKUs or new beers on the shelf. So this one's really just limited in its release over the last few months. So we have a lot of it.
Well, Brian, I can tell you this is the first time I've tried it, and it's really wonderful. I'm going to bring it up a little closer. It has a very nice color associated with it. It's effervescent. You could really feel the pop when I opened it, so it has a nice carbonation, and it holds that and I've had it since we first started talking. It holds that carbonation real nicely, and that's really an important attribute of a good beer. It should hold the carbonation a bit and maintain some foam and head on it, so it has that look and feel of a quality beer. And so this is really a good go-to summer beer. I think this is wonderful, and I can tell from just the smell and the aroma that you do have some hops that are added later. I was surprised that you actually got as high an IBU rating as you got with adding everything late like that. And the IBU measurements that you get are very dependent, as you mentioned, on addition. And when you add hops at the very beginning of a brewing process, you're going to get higher. If you add a certain significant amount, you're going to get higher levels of bitterness, and you're also going to, of course, see higher IBU levels that are measured. And the IBU levels can be measured analytically, or they can be calculated, as you probably know. And we do both in our class. It's a lot of fun to do that. So I wonder, can you say anything about the aging of the hops, or are you using it fresh, or how does that work? What do you think is, in terms of the hop variety you're using, what do you think is the harvest to the time you actually brew with it, and what can you tell us about that?
And even Brian, can you go back and review the hops that you added? We had a question from one of our attendees asking what kind of hops were added into the mix. So go ahead and compile all that together.
Yeah, so this was this was a hop called Sultana. It's relatively new. Hops are a flower really, and genetically those can be mutated and changed. And so this particular hop came from two older hops known as Zeus and Nugget. And so those hops were crossbred to create this particular kind of tropical pineapple flavor. So the hop itself is relatively new. The crop year in which we used it was from last year's crop, so 2019's crop. So it's a relatively fresh hop, and with a hop like this that has a lot of volatile aroma oils in it, you want to use those fresh to kind of preserve those and keep them fresh in the beer. So this beer that everyone's tasting right now is about a month and a half old, so it's still very fresh.
Now, talk a little bit about just the creation of this. This is a new beer. How did you go? What was the process it took to create what we're tasting right now?
That's a good question, Tim, and it really varies from beer to beer. Some beers take 12 tries before you hit the target. Other beers, as Derrick will probably tell you too, it's the first try and it's your best beer, and you just get lucky sometimes. This particular beer, we brewed a couple of times, and we talked about it, and I feel like as brewers, we're very similar to chefs in the kitchen, and we're very familiar with our ingredients. And so if you know your malts and your hops and your yeast strains, you know what flavor profiles they produce, and you know how they interact together relatively well. And so this was one of those beers. We thought about the lack of alcohol or the lower alcohol content. We wanted to make up for those in some ways. So the blonde roasted oats just made sense. A lot of low alcohol beers, you'll see oats used to help with that mouthfeel and body. It does have a unique flavor, which makes it interesting. So we love that blonde roasted oat flavor, and then the Sultana hops was really an experiment for us. We were able to secure some, which was tough to do, but
where are those grown from? Where are those hops grown?
They're grown domestically here in the Pacific Northwest, and so where these particular Sultana came from, I can't tell you, but I know it's in the Pacific Northwest here in the States.
So. Tell me a little bit, both Derrick and Brian. I mean, you're creating a new beer. You're testing it. Who makes that final decision that says, yeah, this is it. This is the one. You've gone through several tastings. You're changing the mix in it. You're changing it a little bit around. But when do you get to that point and say, yeah, this is the right stuff?
Yeah, it's probably different for Derrick and I. Yeah. Go ahead, Derrick.
Well, so it depends on the batch size that your brewery is producing. So our brewery is a 15-barrel brewery. So just for some history, or whatever, a barrel of beer is 31 gallons. So our brewery produces 15 barrels at a time, which is 465 gallons, I think. I think Brian's brewery is a 50-barrel brewery. So for both of us, it's kind of tough to just make a little sample batch of stuff. We both have pilot systems where we do small samples, but sometimes the pilot doesn't quite turn out the same as the big batch that you're making.
Sure.
You want to talk a little bit more about that, Brian? Just yeah, I mean, because you're making a small batch and it may taste one way, but then you're doing something larger. And you've got, I mean, I'm sure the process is just very, as you go through it changes, doesn't it? So.
It does, and it changes from beer to beer. So like Derrick said, we could start on the pilot to develop something. We usually use the pilot when we're developing a beer that just may be out there. And we're going to taste one of those from O'Fallon later, but so that if we're not familiar with the ingredient, we can, we're only brewing a small amount, and we can either throw it across the bar as a test brew or dump it down the drain. But once we get to our scale at 50 barrels or 15 for Derrick, you don't want to waste that amount of beer. So you can make small tweaks on the larger scale, but you want to be relatively comfortable with when you scale it up, what that profile is going to be. And a lot of times for us at O'Fallon, 18 years ago when I started, I made all the decisions when it came to what beers we wanted to produce and whether or not it was ready to be released or the target profile was there. And these days we have a team of brewers and marketing guys and sales guys and owners that all have a different idea sometimes of what beer we should come out with and what that beer should taste like. So, we try to get together as a team and come up with that answer. And sometimes we put it in and everybody approves of it. And other times we put it in and it misses the target completely, and we go back to the drawing board and redesign. So it just depends on the beer. Some are one and done, and others are a 6-month process.
Bruce, where does the science fit into all this?
Well, it's really amazing what you can produce with 4 basic ingredients. I mean, all of these beers, if you expand hops to include spices, then you could include things such as vegetables and fruits and the other spices you might put in. But all beer is based essentially on the malts that are used, which are your grains that are malted. The hops or spices, the water source that you have has a big impact on brewing, and then the yeast strains that you're using have a big impact too. And you can play with these 4, and you can get an infinite variety of flavors out of that. It's endless, and I'm sure that Brian and Derrick could tell you that all of us feel like we've scratched the surface. There's so much you can do with those 4. But when you look at the science of the tasting, it's art and science. It's really both together. You can use the science to help make some predictions, to help set the stage for what you might want to do. I think this is what you would do on a pilot scale. The science helps you predict because you're not going to have the beer ready to drink for 6 weeks to 3 months, depending on the process. And so you'd like to have some way of getting that consistency and getting in there. And then once you have that, of course, it's ingredients, it's the way you handle the process, it's your quality control, and at the end of the day, you taste the beer. And it's the tasting that counts in the end. You've got to have that right. And as much as I love the science, I have to say that the taste panel rules, doesn't it? Because if it doesn't taste good, no one's going to want to drink it. But I think...
So we have a couple of questions from some of our attendees. Angie is asking, how long do you pilot? And what does a typical pilot look like?
Well,
so for us, go ahead, Derrick.
Our pilots are just 5-gallon batches, and usually what we do is we split off a batch from a big beer. So we take 5 gallons from a 15-barrel batch, and then we use that as a separate 5-gallon batch in a glass carboy to test out different flavors or spices or whatever.
Brian?
Yeah, we're similar in a way. We have a 50-barrel production brew house, and we have a 5-barrel pilot. So for us, it's 150 gallons for a pilot, which is relatively large. So we do have a smaller 10-gallon system that we use sometimes. But to Derrick's point, it's hard to translate from a really small batch to a large batch. So we brew our pilots on the 150-gallon setup, and for us, it's usually 2 to 4 weeks to produce a pilot batch. And so we'll run it through the normal process that we would for the bigger batch. And in the end, if we'll usually put it on tap at the bar and offer it as something unique that people can only get at the O Bar. And then we'll go back to the drawing board and make adjustments if needed and do it again on the pilot or maybe scale it up to the bigger system. So
one more question. This is from Samir to all of you. Where do you get the idea for new brews, and what was the best experiment you had, and what was the least successful? Go ahead, Brian.
There was a time, I'm guessing it was probably, 15 years ago at O'Fallon that the owner at the time decided we should make a light beer. And in terms of a light beer, he meant like a commercial light lager. And so, I think the idea was good and the beer turned out great. I loved the beer. It had a little more flavor than a traditional light beer, but we couldn't compete from a pricing standpoint with the commercial light beers in the market at the time. So I think it was one of those ideas that was a unique idea, but once we came to fruition with it, we're never going to sell a 6-pack of light beer for $9 when you could buy 30 of them for 15. So that was kind of one of those projects that turned into a failure.
And the former owner took that beer with them, and they may still be drinking it today. Who knows?
Hey, it's a little oxidized at this point.
Right.
So let's move on. We're running through these very quickly, and it's time to move on to our next beer. And the next one, this one, I'm going to turn it over to Derrick to talk about from Alpha, the Swingle American Ale. Derrick, take it away.
Cool, man. Wait, sorry, I was trying to plug in my phone during the little intermission there. Which beer are we tasting now? Is it the Divine Intervention or the Swingle?
The Swingle.
Ah, right. Well, so Swingle kind of grew out of, and it's kind of funny. Well, I didn't even get a can of it, so I had to get a growler of it for you guys. I forgot.
like your thought process.
We're coming over to visit now that we know you got a growler.
More's better. So this beer, back to Brian's point where he was talking about how it takes a long time to get a beer to fruition. This beer, I think we probably did 60 brew days with a whole bunch of different fruits and spices and whatnot. So it started as a collaboration with Gorilla Street Food Truck. They were making a lemonade from a Filipino fruit called calamansi, which is kind of a cross between a lemon and a lime. It's a citrus fruit, and we did a collaboration with them, and it was really good. We thought it was cool, but turns out calamansi fruit imported from the Philippines, super expensive and not very cost effective for making a product that you can actually sell. So we tried it with lemons, and then we tried it with oranges, and then we finally tried it with limes, and the lime really worked out. So this beer is it's a blonde ale. The hops are Cascade. The grain bill is 90% two-row base malt and 10% flaked oats. And it's 1 or 2% lime juice. And it makes quite the summertime crushable, refreshing beverage, I think.
Cheers, Derrick. It's great. I love it. And I want to ask you, when do you add the lime juice to it? Is that during conditioning, or at what point do you actually formulate it with lime juice?
Right. So citric acid, if you add it during the boil, it will decompose. So we have to add it on the cold side after fermentation is complete, and we're transferring the beer from the fermentation vessel into the bright tank. That's when we add the lime juice to it.
Okay, so it goes into a bright tank, and then it conditions for a number of days after that with the lime juice at that point, right? But that's all colder temperatures, and all the flavors are maintained, I would presume.
Right. So when the beer's in the fermentation tank, we're temperature controlling it, and for this particular strain of yeast is called the Chico strain. It was isolated by Sierra Nevada in, I think, 1988, and it's really the American yeast strain. Every brewery in the United States uses this strain of yeast. It's a clean ale fermenting yeast strain. And that's what we use in the Swingle, as well as a bunch of other of our beers. It's also used in our other beer, Divine Intervention. And I suspect half the beers at O'Fallon are also brewed with the Chico strain. But this particular yeast strain really likes 68 degrees Fahrenheit fermentation temperature. So we actively cool the tank with a cold water system to make sure that the tank is always that temperature. And yeast really produces a lot of heat when it's fermenting. So you really have to remove that heat. Otherwise, you'll get a whole bunch of nasty off flavors, which you just don't want.
That's right. So when you are using the Chico yeast, is that correct? Is it, can you reuse it and collect it from each vat, or are you just using fresh stocks of it each time? Or how do you handle your yeast?
Well, so all the fermentation tanks they have a cone on the bottom. So after the fermentation's done, the yeast falls out, and then you can pull the yeast off the bottom and put it into a certain vessel to transfer it into the next batch of beer. So generally we use our yeast 4 or 5 times, and then it kind of starts going sideways. It doesn't, there's a couple things it doesn't do. Sometimes it doesn't attenuate all the way if you use it too many times in a row, which means it doesn't ferment all the way down. so it doesn't eat all the sugars, and then you get a little bit of a sweeter beer that's not as alcoholic. Or it does this other thing where it doesn't flocculate, and flocculation is where the yeast falls out, so you end up with a clear beer instead of some super cloudy thing.
Oh my, so you really want to control that carefully.
Right.
This seems like, I mean, this is obviously a very seasonal beer. This seems like a summer beer here for sure. I mean, what's the thinking that goes into some of the seasonal brews that you brew, and how does this fit into that in terms of the kind of thinking that you have when you're creating some of these things?
Well, actually, Tim, this beer is a year-round beer because
Is it really?
everyone wishes it was summertime all year.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah, when you have one that's successful, it makes sense to have it all year round. I think that's a great idea.
I've got a question here from Kevin, who is asking, are some fruits easier to work with than others, or does it just come down to how they taste? Meaning that do different fruits react differently in the process, and are there some fruits that you just stay completely away from?
Man, everyone loves raspberries.
Yeah.
Raspberries is the brewer's dream fruit.
Why?
They're tart. They have a pop to them. Who hates raspberries?
Raspberry is a popular fruit flavor. It's also, to Derrick's point, with other fruits, it can be very expensive if you're using real raspberries or raspberry concentrate. And some of those fruits are relatively inexpensive and easy to secure and get, and some of them translate naturally as their flavor you would expect their flavor to be, and then other fruits don't translate in the beer at all as you would expect them to. And so something like watermelon is mostly water, right? And it just doesn't translate in the beer if you use it in the natural form. So if you can, at O'Fallon, we found a good combination for fruits for us is fruit concentrates, and Derrick may use some of these as well. So a concentrated fruit and or a top note or a natural flavor extract to help support it. And so a lot of times with fruit, we can go with the natural fruit itself and get a great flavor, but we miss out on the aroma, which is a lot of times where you want that fruit to present itself. And so a combination of real fruit with a natural fruit top note or extract sometimes is a good combination for us.
Right. It's a bummer process called CO2 scrubbing, where actually the fermentation process pushes out all those fruity esters that we really want to keep in the beer, but it pushes them out because the carbon dioxide's pushing up through the tank and then pushing the flavors out of the beer.
Why
those flavors
does
are all.
that happen? Yeah, why does that happen, Bruce?
Well, those flavor components that they're trying to trap in there are very aromatic, and so when you think about their physical properties, they're volatile is another way to think of that. So you have the CO2 gas coming off, and they're going to dissolve in CO2, and so then they're carried away. That's how we actually recognize a lot of fragrances that we can smell and detect, is because they're odoriferous, right? Because they're carried in the environment, and CO2 is a wonderful carrier. CO2 is used for extraction in a lot of processes, and so it just makes sense that if you have it in a brewery, it can carry it out. So I imagine when you're using fruits, then can you add them late in like a secondary conditioning phase to try to trap more of the flavor? Or is that timing something you can take advantage of?
I mean, the bummer is that all the fruits we had. So we just made a raspberry sour that will be available next spring on our anniversary day, April 10th. But the problem is the fruit has so much sugar content. I think the raspberry puree we just added to this batch was 14 bricks, which means it's 14% sugar by volume, that you just can't suppress the yeast to not eat that sugar. And otherwise, you're going to end up with a really, really sweet beer instead of something that's kind of drier, which most people like the drier stuff instead of the sweet stuff.
Right. So while we're on the subject of fruits, we have a poll. So here it comes. What is your favorite fruit flavor in beer? And we don't have raspberry on the list. So if you could, no, we can't even. Well, if raspberry is your favorite, just add it to the chat, and we'll it won't be very scientific in the tabulation of it. But choose your favorite fruit flavor here, and we'll see what the voting turns out to be. Yeah. There it goes.
Derrick, do you have a favorite from that list?
And the
I'm sorry, what was that?
I was just wondering if you had a favorite from that list.
I picked mango. I'm partial to the mangoes. They are super. They're terrible to process because they have that huge, ridiculous pit. But mango flavored beers. What do you think, Brian?
Yeah, I would agree with mango. We just did a beer with some mango and raspberry, and it was a sour as well, and it made for a nice flavor combination. So it's just one of those natural fruits that translates well in beer.
I mean,
Nice. I'll come pick some up.
I'll save you some.
Is there a different type of beer drinker that's going to choose something with fruit in it versus something else, or is it universal? I mean, do folks like trying?
I thought it was super funny. So when I was looking at the lineup for all the beers that were in this tasting, I think 4 of them out of 5 were fruit beers. Both
Really?
of ours are fruit beers. We have a blood orange and a lime beer, and then the bramble is a fruit beer, and then the margarita is a lime beer as well. So there's only one beer that doesn't have fruit in it in this.
That's pretty crazy, really. I think people tend more towards fruit.
We have another question about from Sarah, who asks, is it easier to make an IPA or a sour with fruits?
Ooh.
You know, I think it just depends more on the very specific beer that you're making. It could be an easy IPA with fruit or a hard IPA with fruit. And sour, I think, is the same way. I mean,
some who may not know, what's that mean? Easy and hard. Talk about what's that mean?
Easy and hard really is just recipe development and process for brewing. And so, in particular, one of the difficult beers for us is pumpkin. Pumpkin as a fruit is something that is the difficult beer to make from a process standpoint. So when we start our pumpkin season, we're like dreading it as brewers for most of the year, and drinkers love it. And then in the last pumpkin brew that we have in September, October, we celebrate because it's just a hard beer. And so there are complicated IPAs, I think, to brew and run through the processing, and then there are easy IPAs, which is just, it really has more to do with just the amount of work and processing that goes into each individual recipe. So I think it can be difficult or easy for either style, sour or IPA.
So I've got one more question, and then we're going to move on to the next beer. But for something like for a beer like this, Derrick, is it going to taste different coming out of a tap than it is out of a can? How much different is that taste going to be?
I always prefer things out of the tap personally.
Yeah, I do but I just wonder how much difference it's going to be.
So the really funny thing is, for this particular batch of Swingle, it's the exact same tank. We just hooked the can line up to the tank. Canned up half of it, and then we kegged up the other half. So it's the exact same beer. I think when you're drinking stuff out of a can, like when you're drinking it out of a pint, you really get your nose in the beer, and you can smell it a lot more, and a lot of your flavor perceptions come from the smell. Now, when you're drinking out of a can, you just got that little hole there, and your nose has nothing to smell. So I think it changes how it tastes because of the vessel you're drinking it out of. And I really, really liked when Urban Chestnut used to have those pull top cans where you could open the top of the can, if you remember those. Mm-hmm. But they discontinued them for some reason, I don't know. But I really like that method of drinking beer out of a can if you could smell it, actually.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the other point too is once you pour it into a glass, either off the tap or from the can into a glass, I think draft and packaged beer, or canned or bottled beer, could taste relatively similar if you decant that bottled beer or canned beer into a glass. And so by the action of pouring the beer either from the tap or from the can into another vessel, you're taking a lot of that carbonation out of the beer, which affects not only the flavor but the mouthfeel and the, that fullness feeling that you get with carbonation.
All right, we are 2 beers down. We have 3 more to go. And
okay.
And so we're gonna go to more. Brian, you got the Raspberry Kolsch for us right here.
Gotta love the Bramble. This is also a new beer for us, and this beer has a funny story. And this kind of goes back to a little bit of the piloting and a little bit of the fruit that we were talking about. So this beer started as a raspberry Kolsch. We really wanted to make a true raspberry Kolsch, and Kolsch really is for those that aren't familiar, is a German style that was developed in Cologne, Germany, I think in the late 1800s or something like that. Very light, very refreshing, little bit of bitterness. With this particular beer, we called it a Kolsch, but clearly it doesn't look like a Kolsch because it has raspberries and blueberries in it. But the base style is pretty close. We use the traditional type of hops that you would find in a Kolsch. We've got some Hallertau and some Tettnang hops in this beer. So again, because it's in our summer pack, we wanted to keep it light and refreshing. It's 4% alcohol. Calorie-wise, it's, you know, for those that are counting those things, it seems to be more of a concern these days with beer than it used to be. It's about 110 calories, so it's one of those really easy drinking beers. But because it started as a raspberry Kolsch and it started on the pilot system, we brewed it in the pilot not to scale to the production. We just brewed it to have on tap in the bar. And so when you think about selling beer on the shelf versus selling beer in your own bar, and Derrick can attest to this too, there's a lot more room for margin or profit across the bar in your own establishment. And when you package a beer to sell on the shelf at a competitive price to other beers, you don't have as much room for that margin. And so when we decided we really liked the beer and we wanted to scale it up and produce it on a larger scale, you know, when I priced out the raspberry concentrate that we used in the pilot to scale up for production, we would have lost money selling this beer in the market. And so because it's a 4% beer, because it's a lined price beer and comparative to all of our other brands, we had to sell it within that price point. So we compromised and decided to use blueberry concentrate as a portion of that fruit. And the funny part about it was after we brewed it with the blueberry, we liked it. Some liked it as much and some liked it more than the raspberry Kolsch to begin with. So it was one of those decisions we had to make from a business standpoint to change the beer. And, you know, we've done it in the past. I've had ideas for beers in the past that we just couldn't price and get to a flavor that we liked, so we didn't make them. This just happened to be one of those beers that when we made the adjustment with the blueberry concentrate, it actually made the beer as good or better than the original.
So where'd the name come from?
So bramble is a bush, right? And the two fruits that we're using, the blueberry and the raspberry, and it was just kind of one of those things. This was one that I named, and the names come from everybody in the company. But I was just kind of doing some research, and I thought bramble for a bush-grown fruit, I thought was an appropriate name. It just it seemed like they had a ring to it.
It has a great
Some
look
other names
to
don't
it.
have a.
Yeah, I like the way it looks in the glass, and it's very refreshing. So it's a good beer for a refreshing summer drink. And again, you know, the fruits really add to the flavor. They really come out in it. You can really tell. I wanted to ask you now, I noticed we got this in bottles. So do you bottle this now and have it available in bottles? I know it's a little expensive to have it over the counter like that, but is that something that's available?
We do. So, you know, some of our brands only come in the sampler pack and some of them only come in bottle or can, but we sell this in a 4-6 pack bottle, in a 4-6 pack can, and then it also comes in our summer sampler pack as well. So we sell this one kind of across the board.
Brian,
Wonderful.
We've got a question from Jacqueline, just wondering in terms of where distribution of these beers, where can folks buy the beers at? Are they available at Schnucks and Deerbergs and those places?
They are. So, you know, all of the familiar grocery stores, liquor stores, you know, we've got beer, we've got some beer and QTs. And so pretty much every establishment that carries most mainline beers, you'll find R.O. Fallon beers. And we distribute, I think, in 13 states. But, you know, over the last few years, there's so many beers that have come out from so many new breweries that we've kind of pulled back a little bit, like a lot of breweries our size, and focused more on local and regional because, you know, folks want to drink what's close to them, what's fresh and local. And as a brewer, I don't blame them for that. So although we'd love to sell beer across the country, we know that as it gets further from St. Louis, we have less control over the freshness. We have less control over the sales. And so we've done a good job, I think, of pulling back a little bit and still maintaining or increasing our sales.
So we've been talking about a Kolsch, but there may be some folks out there that are wondering, what does that mean? Bruce, do you want to touch on that? I you know, it's obviously a German beer of some sort, right? Or German hop.
Well, I'm going to defer somewhat to I'm going to defer to Brian and Derrick on the Kolsch, but I know when we make it in class, when we do make a Kolsch on time, we use a different yeast that's a Kolsch-based yeast. And so a lot of the other ingredients might be similar in terms of your malt and your hops, but we use a different yeast. And then we have a different fermentation temperature that we use for the kolches in our class. And it's usually a little bit colder. It's not as cold as you would have for a lager beer. Ales you typically ferment at higher temperatures, maybe 68 degrees Fahrenheit or 18 degrees centigrade. The lagers, of course, you can have at lower temperatures. That might be 50 degrees Fahrenheit or something of that sort. And the kolsch is somewhere in between, but it's very dependent on the kolsch strain. So that's what we do in class. I'd like to know what a real brewer does, so I'd like to hear from Brian and Derrick on that.
Yes, so we've used the Kolsch strain, kind of when Derrick mentioned Chico and Kolsch are our two strains, our house strains of yeast that we use. And to Derrick's point, when he said he mentioned fermenting at 68 degrees, and Bruce mentioned as well, the change in the temperature of fermentation can change the flavor and the aroma of the beer completely. And so the ester profiles or the fruity characteristics that are in a beer typically come from an ale strain or a beer that's fermented at a higher temperature. So ales at 68, you get a lot of those fruity estery characteristics. Lagers, like Bruce mentioned, that are fermented in the 50s have a lot more of a cleaner profile without those fruity characteristics. So Kolsch really falls kind of in the middle, and it's almost known as a hybrid between ale and lager. So it has a lot of clean sulfur-like characteristics that you would find from a lager strain, but some of the esters that you would find from an ale, if that makes sense. But the idea with the Kolsch was to compete with the lagers when they were developed in Germany. So they wanted to keep them close to the flavor profile of a lager.
Anything to add? Yeah. So somebody got a question from Michael on just the idea of naming a beer. How hard is it to name a beer, and do the beer ideas sound a whole lot better after 6 or 7 beers than they did after 1?
Yeah, the beer ideas get much better after 7 beers. Kind of the problem with trying to figure out what kind of beer you're going to make after 7 beers is you're not really thinking about the cost effectiveness of your beer. I mean, we could always make a 29% pumpkin, raspberry, oatmeal stout or whatever aged in bourbon barrels for 29 years, but
it sounds like a collaboration.
$270
naming
a bottle.
Naming is.
I'm sure that marketing folks get into the mix with this. I mean, it's probably a real team effort to really come up with what we're going to name those beers.
Well, going back to what Brian was talking about earlier, so he was talking about, like, how do you develop a new beer? Like, there are many different departments in your business that are focused on this. You have to have a label guy that makes a good label. You have to decide what size package you're going to put it in. You're going to put it in, this size bottle. You're going to put it in 16-ounce cans or 12-ounce cans. You're going to put it in 750s size, those wine size bottles. So there's a lot of talking about how are you going to market this beer to people more than just, well, cool, we came up with a really cool apricot sour. Okay, cool. Is it going to be in 6-packs or 4-packs or big cans, small cans? There's a lot of stuff that you really have to balance against the other things to come up with a product.
My guess is if you're a fairly small brewery, those are big decisions because failure is not a great thing when you're a small brewer, right?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, failure's not the ideal situation. Of course.
I think Derrick, you may have replied to a question, but I think it's worth talking about a little bit more as well. You replied in the chat, but talking about growing your own locally sourced or using any ingredients. I mean, hops have a certain place on the globe where hops are grown, right? If I'm familiar with this.
Right. So hops really like cold and wet.
A little bit about that for some folks who may not know where hops are actually grown, and the fact that it's really a place on the planet where all hops are grown.
So there's 4 places on the planet that hops are grown: Pacific Northwest of the United States, England, Germany, and New Zealand. And all of those regions have something in common. It rains a lot, and it's a little bit cooler, like not 100 degrees, and it's cooler, usually high altitude, except for England. So we actually have a hop garden at the UMSL Community Garden. That's right up next to campus, and we've been growing hops there for several years. We've used them for the first couple years, but unfortunately, it's just so hot in Missouri that we're watching these vines grow and the hop cones look really nice and good. Like, okay, cool, we'll harvest them tomorrow. And you come back the next day and the sun just cooked them into brown pieces of leather. So it's really tough to grow hops in St. Louis, at least, just because the sun's too intense and it's 100 degrees outside. And hops usually come, the plants usually come up in the middle of July or something, late July, early August. And man, that's just not a great time for cool weather in St. Louis.
It takes an effort in this area for sure. So there are a few guys that do it, and like you're talking about, Derrick, it is not easy. We work with a small farm called Valley Farms out in Forestville, Missouri, and they have probably 60, maybe 50 to 60 hop vines that they grow every year. And now they spend a lot of time and effort with irrigation, and they've selected a couple of varieties that work better than others in Missouri. So they grow, I think, Willamette and Nugget, I think, did well for them. So we partnered with them in the past to get just enough hops to brew a small pilot batch with and make a fresh hop beer. But I know they work a lot harder than most that are in those zones, and they're lucky from year to year. So those years where we just get baked in the sun in July and August, to Derrick's point, they just burn up. This last year we had a pretty good year here in St. Louis as far as heat and moisture were concerned. And we got a decent crop from our friends at Valley Farms, and so we use those to make a fresh hop beer, which is something that you don't see a whole lot of.
Now, is climate change having an effect on these four spots on the globe that are well known for growing hops? Is climate change having any effect on the production of hops there?
Not to my knowledge, really. It's more of a seasonal thing. So when it comes to storms and hail and drought and some of those things that affect climate change, I think it's more cyclical from what I've seen in the past, where, hops or crop years are bumper crops some years and just, lower on years to follow. So we actually, as a larger brewery, we have to forward contract for these hops so that we can secure them. And some of the varieties are just hard to get because some of them are just low in amounts that are planted, and then other varieties are plentiful some years and not other years. So the price just kind of swings with the climate from year to year. But as far as climate change in general, we haven't seen a whole lot other than what we see seasonally.
Well, I know there's some growers now that are attempting to grow hops in northern Michigan. I don't know if you've seen any of that, but I've heard talk of that. And they may have similar conditions there. I wondered if you had looked into any of that or had a chance to evaluate any of the hops from the Midwest and northern Michigan.
I visited a couple of the wineries in Michigan, but none of the hop farms.
Okay.
We've brought in some hops from Michigan to use in a small amount, but it still falls in that band around the globe, kind of where the Pacific Northwest is, where they grow well. And Colorado's a little further south, but they're doing well with some hops these days also.
Excellent.
Derrick, let's come to you now for our next beer. I love before we even taste it, we got to talk about how did you come up with this name? Divine Intervention Blood Orange Blonde.
Right. So this was a collaboration beer with a local band called Jesus Christ Supercar.
I love it.
They're a pretty fun band. They do some pop punk type stuff. We were planning on having a concert at the brewery in the middle of May, and then the COVID thing happened, so we had to do a live stream for the concert. But we really thought we should still put out the beer because the concept was pretty good. It's a blood orange blonde ale that's dry hopped with a hop called Mandarina, which is very orangey, as you can tell from the name Mandarin. It's a very orangey, citrusy type hop, and I think it really blends well with this blonde ale.
Yeah, that's really good.
Well, that's very nice.
The aroma there is something else.
So will this be a seasonal beer
myself.
for you? Or will this be a seasonal beer, or do you think you'll have this regular available all year round?
Well, so the original idea was to put it out for the concert, and I think I actually really like this beer a lot, and I think it might be replacing one of our pale ales as a regular lineup in our lineup.
Excellent, excellent.
So
Thanks, Sonny.
we've got a couple of questions, not so much about this beer, but I want to ask the questions that we've got. One, beer technique in pouring your beer from a bottle or a can to achieve the right amount of head in your glass. Is there an art to this, or is it just do the best you can? What's the technique for the best pour?
There's sort of a process. And
Yeah.
so it depends on the glass. It depends on the beer that you're drinking. But for me, and Derrick can answer too, is I like to have at least an inch to an inch and a half of head on the beer. So if it's a beer that's highly carbonated, that might mean pouring it gently down the side of the glass the whole time because you don't want to create too much foam. If it's a beer that doesn't have as much carbonation, you may want to pour it straight down the middle. But typically speaking, I would start by holding the glass at a 45, pouring down the side, and then kind of tilting it towards the center as I want that head to increase. And that's like Derrick's got the perfect size head, I think, to deliver all of the aromatics in the beer.
That's how you want it.
Cheers.
Right there. Cheers.
That looks good, Derrick. I like that worked out perfect. Now, I noticed you mentioned on this beer you're using Mandarina hops and you're dry hopping it. Probably people aren't familiar with dry hop as a technique, and you might want to talk about that a little, how you do that, and a little bit about Mandarina.
Right. So generally when you brew a beer, you add hops. So you create a sugar water out of grain. You have the sugar water in a kettle, and you're going to boil it for an hour. And the boiling does a couple things. It removes the oxygen from the beer. It sterilizes it. But it also increases the temperature so that you can extract the hop flavors from the hops. You have to get up to boil to do that process. So if you add hops early in the boil, you're going to get more of the bittering flavors from those hops. If you add the hops later in the boil, like just a couple minutes before the boil's over, then you're going to retain a bunch of the flavoring components of the hops, but not really extract a whole bunch of the bitterness. So generally brewers, say for an IPA, you would add some bittering hops and some flavor hops. But say for a stout, you're going to add some bittering hops to bitter the beer up a little bit, but not really add any flavoring hops because stouts don't have a whole bunch of fruity type flavors in them, obviously. So after all this is all on the hot side in the kettle. You're going to transfer this wort into a fermenter, add yeast, it's going to ferment out, and you're going to have your beer. Now, dry hopping happens after all of this, after the beer is completely fermented out, and you could just keg it up and be done. You can dump some hops into the fermenter, and what it does is it's not on the hot side, so you're not going to extract any of the bitterness, but you are going to dissolve a whole bunch of those fruity esters that come from the hops. So it cuts down the bitterness for those really hoppy beers, but it allows you to dissolve some of those fruity esters.
So hops today have so many flavors associated with them when you think about the aroma. It's a flower, and just like different varieties of roses or petunias can have different odors, these hops have different odors to them. We really notice that. So that means you have a real palette to choose from when you're dry hopping. You're adding that aroma, and you can choose any of these different types of aromas that go along with these modern hops we have. Hops have really changed, haven't they? And in terms of the variety and the constituents in these hops that you can use.
Oh, really big. So when our brewery first opened in 2013, we did sign a hop contract to buy a whole bunch of different types of hops. And if you can get in a time machine and remember 2013, everyone was about the brand newest, coolest IPA. Oh, we have to have the super triple IPA. It's 100 IBUs, it's 130 IBUs, it's 10%. There was a race to the top to have the biggest IPA you could possibly have. And that fad died so fast. And then we were stuck with a really big hop contract worth tens of thousands of dollars of all these hops and it was pre-Citra, pre-Mosaic, pre-Galaxy. Like these are all the really fancy designer hops, I guess you could call them now, that people are really in search of. We signed a hop contract for some lesser hops. I don't know what you want to call them, but Columbus, Centennial, Cascade, Nugget, which you can use, and they're definitely decent hops, but you can't use them in the quantity or a variety that you really want to use in a modern IPA that people are looking for these days.
So the designer hop idea. So Bruce, is that something that that a chemist would be cooking up in a lab in terms of creating something like that? What does that mean, designer hop?
Well, there's been a real growth in the science that's looking into these hops, and it's really tough to nail down exactly what these flavor components could be, because, you know, when you look at the hops, there's hundreds of components in them that combine to give you the aroma and the flavors that are produced in a particular line of hops. And so there's a lot of a sophisticated analysis, which we could get into. We look at a little bit of that in our class as well, but you could use chromatography, like gas chromatography and liquid chromatography with mass spectrometers. So this sounds good. We're getting geeky now, and you can really pull out these instruments. But these are instruments that most brewers can't afford to use. I mean, even as far as that goes, the big players like Anheuser-Busch only have these located in specific technical centers where they'll actually use this kind of instrumentation. Other than that, you find it in academic environments, but they're still trying to figure out how to label all the varieties of hops. I think today that it really is similar to the kinds of ways you think about wines and flavors in wines, in that they have a full palette of different types of flavors and aroma. The hops and the strain of yeast that you have combined in beer can give you just as fascinating a palate comparison to what you see in wines. And it's going to take us a long time to sort that out.
Now, I've got a question from Kevin.
You know, I really think...
Can I ask this?
I'm sorry.
Comment, but Kevin wanted to know at what point is the blood orange added, and was it similar to the lime earlier?
Right. See, you really shouldn't be adding fruits on the hot side, because if you add the fruit into the boil, it will cook it. And I've heard this question 1,000 times at the brewery. Well, when do you add the fruit? I will challenge you. Take orange juice, boil a cup of orange juice in a pan, put it back into a glass, and then put it back in your fridge, and then taste them side by side later. They definitely taste different. One definitely tastes cooked, even maybe browned a little bit, because when you're adding heat to it, you're allowing the molecules to interact with oxygen more, and it will brown up whatever you're trying to put in there. So you definitely want to add fruit on the cold side if you can.
So I'm curious for both of you, how much continuing education as brewers do you have to learn about new techniques and some of the new science that's coming out to keep in touch with all of this?
We definitely got to drink a lot of beers.
So you got to drink a lot of beer just to appreciate, you know, the results of these new techniques. But there are so many things going on in craft beer these days. And just looking back to, you know, kind of Bruce's point and Derrick's point about designer hops, and hops in the past were sold for bitterness. They were sold for the amount of bitterness that they would provide to beer. And it's just recently in the last, you know, 10 to 20 years where there's been enough acreage opened up and enough interest in experimenting with these different types of hops and crossbreeding for different aromas when that really wasn't the focus in the past. And so there are just so many new techniques and processes that are being used specifically in dry hopping, and how a beer is dry hopped, and the amount of hops that you should use to reach a maximum level of aroma in the beer, and different processes of how you circulate those hops when you're adding them to the tank. And so the sky is the limit for the 10,000 breweries around the country that are experimenting and trying to develop and come up with new techniques for these processes. So it's almost like there's more to learn and know now about brewing, because we have those tools to measure that we didn't have in the past,
and probably
and learn.
With so much more competitiveness out there, with so many breweries starting up, small and medium sized and larger, but the competition to find new tastes and new techniques and new ways to brew things is probably, it just creates more urgency for you to come up with different ideas, doesn't it?
I wouldn't say that really. So craft beer, our main goal. So we're in the Brewers Association in St. Louis, and we're in a Missouri Brewers Guild too. The real goal of craft beer is to suck people away from drinking a Michelob Ultra and drinking a Smirnoff Ice, and drinking boring spirits like a Canadian Club and stuff like that. You know, we really want to get people involved in the flavors and tasting profiles of the stuff we're making, and you know, really deliver something new and special to people. You know, if you just want to have the same thing every day, like my Uncle Dave, he drank a 30 rack of Bud Light every day. Cool. I mean, keep doing that, bud. But we got something cool and different for you.
So Derrick, I have a question about that I've been interested in thinking about ingredients. And now when you look at the ingredients you have, even the hops, I imagine that the same style of hop, if you're using a citrus or whatever it might be, or more modern hops, it might actually change its aroma characteristics year to year, field to field, producer to producer. You know, you could look at beers. Do you want it to be consistent, or do you want to have some variation that makes it interesting every time you try it? And where do you land on that when you try to look at hops?
Yeah, I think that's something to discuss, and it's really tough. I mean, so grain is very consistent year over year. The maltsters that all of us use are very professional, and they make sure the grain is exactly the same every year. But hops, good year, bad year, and some of the hops we're using are grown in regions where there's like forest fires, for instance. Ooh. That well, if you want some smoked hops, I think you can get some from Oregon last year.
Wow.
So you know, well, and it happened for wine too.
Yes, it did.
It's just, you know, we're using products that are grown. It's not some sort of manufactured raspberry, blueberry, snozberry flavor. It's something that's a real thing that you have to grow, and we always have to take that into account. But to that point, the hop companies really give you a whole bunch of analytics about the hops. They give you a whole spreadsheet full of all sorts of different the oils that are in the hops and stuff like that. So you can adjust your recipe a little bit to account for, say, this batch is a little bit less bitter than the first batch that you used previously.
I'm curious, and I want to move on to the next beer because I'm really excited about this last one. But the hop companies that you talk about, are these large, big businesses, or a lot of these just smaller farms, smaller companies that are producing these hops? What is that sector, that business sector, like? Brian,
it used to be a lot of large hop growers and processors. And the processors are still pretty large these days because the investment it takes to take these hops from the field as whole cones or whole flowers and process them into pellets, which is how most brewers use hops these days, is a very expensive endeavor. So the processors are still relatively large and few and far in between, although there are some smaller processors popping up. But as far as growers are concerned, there are so many small growers, I think, popping up in, you know, as Bruce mentioned, Michigan and Colorado, and even some small hop growers in other states, to Derrick's point, where they don't grow very well, but certain varieties can be harvested and grown. And so you see a lot more smaller craft style hop growers these days that can grow specifically something that the folks in that area want to use.
And to that point, there's also, I've been getting newsletters from a whole bunch of craft maltsters that are making different sort of caramel malts, chocolate malts, all sorts of different stuff that I've been eager to try.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, me too. I've seen some of those as well. So you do see a lot more variation these days.
All right, well, let's go to the is it a Margaripa IPA or Margaripa IPA? How do you even pronounce?
I'm really excited for this one.
Go ahead, Brian.
So yeah, we call it, I mean, you pronounce it however you like, but this is one of those beers that when we talk about naming beers, there's a whiteboard in my office that anybody's allowed to write on, after work, after a couple of beers or during work. And some of them are pretty crazy, but this is one that popped up on the whiteboard. So it's a Margaripa is how we refer to it as. So it's a margarita style IPA. And in today's day and age, as Derrick mentioned and can attest to, it's the largest category still. Wow. And it used to be more of a traditional style IPA. It was always known as like East Coast and West Coast IPA. And so the West Coast IPAs were traditionally a lot more bitter, and the East Coast IPAs were a lot more aromatic and not as bitter. Nowadays, IPAs are all over the map. They're sour, they're fruited, they're they're funky, they're Belgian. And so we tried to kind of carve our niche in the category, and Derrick and all of the other local breweries around town all fight for that niche and fight for something unique and different in the IPA category. And so, we make a traditional 5-day IPA, which is as traditional as IPAs get. And then we came up with this Margarita, which is as far out there, I think, as some IPAs go. So I'm going to tell you from the beginning, I did not like the idea of this beer. So I'm more of a traditional style drinker. And I thought, just this quirky Margarita style IPA, and Devin, our head brewer at O'Fallon, who just came on board a few years ago, we just promoted him up to lead brewer, came to me with this idea for Margarita style IPA. And I said, I don't like it, but you should brew it. And he did. And man, did he nail it. And did he change my mind? What I love about this beer is it kind of hits all the points, I think, that you see on the label. So the target was Margarita. We really wanted to go for that Margarita characteristic. It's a 6% alcohol beer, but we're using all of the traditional ingredients that you would find in a Margarita. So we're using concentrated lime juice. We're using some blue agave syrup. We're using a little pink Himalayan sea salt. And so we wanted to create that Margarita feel and theme. But at the same time, we're also using, it's an IPA, right? So hops are the thing that we focused on. So we're using Citra and El Dorado hops. Two of those, as Derrick mentioned, those designer style hops. And these were hops that we kind of contracted back when they were available and reasonably priced, still expensive. So we were lucky enough to have some laying around. And so we added almost 1.5 pounds per barrel. And brewers kind of measure dry hopping in pounds per barrel. And so we use about 1.5 pounds per 31 gallons of beer. So we're dumping hundreds of pounds into a tank. So you get all of the characteristics from the El Dorado and the Citra. And the El Dorado is kind of a tropical pear or stone fruit. And then the Citra gives a little bit of that lime characteristic, but also tropical. So we also use lactose in this beer, which is a milk sugar. And we do that so that we can enhance the sweetness. Margaritas are the perfect balance of sweet and tart, I think, right? That sweet and sour. The best margarita, I think, has a little bit of sugar in the background and then enough lime to cut through the sugar. And so we use a little lactose to kind of bring the sweetness up and give it that sweet and sour balance from the lime and the salt.
I think it's great.
And so, hey, thanks. So as much as I was ready to hate this beer,
you achieved a real nice balance with this. It's a really nice balance between the bitter flavors and the tropical kind of fruit flavor that you can get in it. You can smell that, you can feel it, and it makes it really refreshing. I mean, when I drink this, I wouldn't have thought of IPA necessarily, even though I'm sure you can measure a certain value of bitterness. It seems to somehow the fruit flavors and things in it seem to mediate that somewhat.
Well, it seems to be a normal thing now that breweries are using lactose as a back sweetener to allow themselves to dry hop more. So the lactose sweetens up the beer a little bit so that you can dry hop more so that you're still on an even keel as far as the flavor profile overall.
That's a good point, Derrick, because you're right. It's really about perceived bitterness. You can measure the bitterness, like you said, Bruce, and this beer comes in at 41 IBUs. So on the scale of, 0 to 100 at 15 for the 3.3, it's all about perceived bitterness. So if there's enough sweetness in the background, you're not going to perceive that 41 IBUs the same as you would even the 15 in the 3.3 because it's a very dry beer. So it's really all about, like Derrick said, finding that balance of bitterness and sweetness. And that's kind of where a lot of the IPAs these days are headed towards hazy and juicy. And that description really has to do with the bitterness, the perceived bitterness being low, and the hop character, the aroma, being high. And so that's kind of where we were headed with this beer.
So I've got to believe that this went through several renditions before you got to the final product. And I bet there were some train wrecks there to get there. How was that process?
Yeah, I would say, I would say no train wrecks. I think a train wreck would have derailed the project. Because I was not on board.
Right.
But there were lots of tweaks. And to your point, Tim, this was one of those beers where finding the balance between lime and salt. I'll tell you that the agave syrup doesn't add a whole lot. That's something that we add in secondary. It ferments out. And so it adds a little bit of character, but not nearly as much as the lime and the salt in this beer. And so finding the balance of all of those is tough, but it's easy to produce when you can produce a beer that you really like. And that was the key, to produce a really good IPA with the lactose, with the hops. After that beer's done, we can play around in the lab with 5 ounces at a time by mixing up a little bit of salt, a little bit of lime. So it's not like we have to go back to the pilot system to adjust those ingredients. So we know we create a great base beer, and then we can take that beer, and for all of the secondary additions, like we talked about with fruit and spices, and we can make all that happen in the lab pretty quickly. So there were a lot of iterations of this beer and a lot of opinions of how much lime and how much salt, and we went back and forth with the brewing team a long time. But I really do think that everybody's happy about where we landed with this one.
It's really funny when you have those tasting panels and you like ask 10 people, hey, so do you like the lime content? And then you have 4 people say, man, it's way too salty. And then you have 4 people say, man, it's not salty enough. Like,
that's exactly what happens.
And Brian says, this is the one I like, and we're going.
You can never please anyone.
Yeah.
Everyone.
You're right. It's always not enough or too much,
Right. Did you ever consider putting mango in this beer?
Addition to this beer. But I'll tell you, we may have lost money on this beer. I mean, it is
Oh my.
by far the most expensive beer we've produced and sold commercially. So, my suggestion is that we continue to make this beer, and then we just raise the price $1 if we need to, So it's one of those things where at the end of the day, we were working hard on developing this recipe. And by the time it got priced out and put on the shelf, I think we all looked at each other and said, did we actually profit from this beer? I'm not sure.
What is this going for?
This is a 16-ounce 4-pack. I'm guessing it's in the $8.99 range. So.
Oh man, no
That's
way.
very reasonable. That's
Yeah.
very
Yep.
reasonable.
So I have a question from Jack
Okay.
who's asking about the idea of lactose, of putting information on the can about lactose because some people are lactose intolerant.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think that that is something that a lot of brewers probably ignore from time to time. It's easy to, well, it's not easy for everybody. Even with something like a milk stout, folks wouldn't necessarily expect for lactose to be on the label. So, those are things that probably we should be a little bit more sensitive to. I mean, even with a beer like pumpkin, when we're adding cinnamon and nutmeg and clove, we should probably be a little more forthright about spices that may cause allergies in folks. Now, granted, they're at a very low level, but there are those that are sensitive to it. So, the FDA, I think, is working to regulate all of those things and make sure that we get those appropriate things on the label. But it's kind of a work in process.
Yeah, and certainly the marketing people are going to not want you to put a whole lot of those types of things on the labels because it might scare people off.
Yeah, yes, I think that's why the FDA, I think, is really working to step in and regulate some of those things, because some of it's a little bit of an overreach, I think, when it comes to what's allowed to go on the label, and some of it really needs to be regulated and put on there.
So Kevin is asking, Kevin Looney's asking a question that I think after you mentioned the term, probably everyone who's listening and watching is wondering is, how do I get on a tasting panel?
Well, you could work at the brewery.
You volunteer to intern at the brewery. We might be one of the few industries where, we get a lot of volunteers that come in, and Bruce can attest to this too. We've had some UMSL students that have come in and volunteer intern for credit at school, but these are unpaid internships. And most of the time, those unpaid internships turn into jobs in the brewery. And those are the dedicated and passionate folks that belong there for sure.
Yeah, we've had students in our class that have interned at various breweries around town, including O'Fallon and probably Alpha as well. But I think that not Alpha yet. We're going to send some to you, Derrick.
Yeah, send me some.
So I know we've talked about that, and we've had people who have taken the class and then have really become passionate about working in the brewing industry. And I get letters back or emails. That's what I get. I get emails back about what they're doing today, working in the brewing industry. So it's a lot of fun. They're fun environments to be in. There's a lot going on. It's exciting. So I can understand why folks would want to do it, and it's a very social environment. So it can be really fun to do.
Bring your
The
own.
kind of people we're always looking for.
Or you supply the pretzels too.
I'm sorry.
I said, bring your own pretzels, or do you supply the pretzels?
I was going to say the kind of people we're looking for all the time at the brewery. It's kind of a twofold thing. They have to be very scientifically literate because the brewing process is a very scientifically driven endeavor, but they also have to be kind of artistic in the sense that they have to be able to like build a recipe from nothing. You know, they have to be able to look at a color palette and then paint a picture in a beer. And it's really tough to find the right guy. You know, everyone's like, man, we would love to come down there and just drink beers all day with you. Right, of course. But I don't want that guy. I want the guy who's like, this beer's pretty good, but did you ever consider using some weird tropical fruit that you've never heard of? Or did you ever consider making it sweeter or using molasses or something, you know, to add something? Everyone likes drinking beer, of course, but we need someone who can actually critique the beer and have that sensory panel that they can taste the flavors, they can smell the aromas and describe them appropriately. That would be well, send those guys over here.
Okay, and finding those kinds of tasters is a challenge. It's kind of like the super taster, you know, the people who really know how to taste things. And
That's right.
I know I'm not one. I know what I like, but a lot of times I'll taste something and I can't even tell you what the flavors are. I just say, well, I liked it. That's fine. So I'm not your man, Derrick. I can tell you that right now.
You come to drink beers with me any day, Bruce.
All right.
We had a question from Tony who was asking this, who read that Emerson is partnering with the brewing program of a university in Belgium and wondering if UMSL has reached out to Emerson for any kind of brewing collaboration. Are you aware of anything like that?
I'm not aware of anything going on at Emerson. I saw that note in the chat and I was kind of surprised. I went, we're in Emerson's backyard, so they're going over to Belgium, huh? So that's interesting.
So,
but maybe I can get a contact with them and find out what's going on.
That's an opportunity. Another question that came, Bruce, and I want to make sure we get this in before we go, but I'm sure a lot of folks are wondering when you're teaching the next brewing course.
The brewing course at this point is offered once a year. And we typically offer it in the spring semester is what we've been doing in the last couple of years, is in the spring semester. That does change from time to time, and I'm always looking at other options. But we will run it in the spring of 2021, and I'm prepared to deliver it whatever's required based on the current situation. So we can have a lot of it available as an online class, and we can have proper distancing in the labs for it because of the numbers that are involved. I think we can handle anything that's going to come down the pike. So
you can come give a talk at the Alpha Brewing Companies in our event space like you did last fall.
I did that last fall, and I'd love to do that again. That was a lot of fun. And
it was a great talk about hop science. It was really good.
So we do have a research program going on in my lab on hop science. And we had been looking at in the past, and I've talked to both Brian and Derrick about this, but in the past we've been looking at bitterness. Clearly you can see from what I've said, I really want to start looking at aroma. And I think aroma profiling is really the way to go. There's some really cool gadgets out there for aroma profiling. Cool. I'm not sure we can afford them all, but some of them
we'll have to pool our funds for that.
Yeah, we'll have to pool our funds. And some of them are simple, and we could really get somewhere with that and help brewers out. That's what it's all about, is helping brewers out and providing opportunities for students to do things that they find interesting. If we can accomplish those things, we've been incredibly successful.
Awesome. I want to talk just a moment here before we let folks go. How about the local beer scene in terms of the craft beer? How competitive or how friendly is it between the craft brewers here in town in terms of working together, sharing some of the things you're working on, or even maybe group buys of material that you need to brew? Can you talk a little bit about just the scene that's happening here in St. Louis? I mean, I've been here 11 years. It's just been astounding how it's grown. But just talk a little bit about your role in part of the craft beer scene here in St. Louis.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, the craft beer scene really from the beginning here in St. Louis, and I've been part of it almost from the start until now, has been super collaborative, and everybody is willing to, help each other out along the way. And that's just kind of the brewing community here in St. Louis and in other places as well. It may get a little competitive on the sales side, but we as brewers, Derrick will know that there's nothing competitive about what we do on the brewing side. And so we know that if someone else is looking to us for advice or help or ingredients, that we're going to be in the same boat, the following week. And so I think that's kind of the mentality for craft brewers, is that we're all small. Even, O'Fallon's a larger craft brewery in the St. Louis area, and there are much smaller craft breweries, but in the big scheme of things, we're all tiny breweries compared to the larger guys out there who are working hard to compete in the craft segment. So as true, local craft brewers, the only way we have to succeed is to support each other in growing our breweries.
Hey, so Brian, how many barrels did you guys make last year?
I think we made somewhere around 15,000 barrels or so, and I'll use the caveat that a half of that was probably our brand. So as a larger 50-barrel production facility, until we can fill that out with our own brands, which is difficult to do these days, we contract for other folks. So I would say, close to half of our business is contract.
So would one of those be Well-Being?
Yes, it is. So the NA brand, Well-Being. Yep.
Yeah. So I really like Well-Being. We carry that at the brewery. Actually, it's an NA product that they have a stout and a blonde and a red. I really like those guys. It's a really They're doing great things, and we're happy to be working with those guys. So we're on the cutting edge of some of the technology that's used to make NA beer these days because of them, and we have a lot of fun doing it. But going back to what you were saying, like do the breweries work together? So you make 15,000 barrels a year. So last year we made 516 barrels, as we report to the Tax and Trade Bureau.
Yep.
Anheuser-Busch last year, I saw on their Business Journal, they made 482 million barrels. So
see what I mean?
So
yeah,
it's a joke. Like the breweries in St. Louis are required to work together because we're only like a drop in the bucket compared to, the guys down there at the corner of Arsenal and Broadway.
Yep. So a couple more questions here for you. One, and I think this is really interesting because, over the last 3 or 4 months, I'm sure that you've had to adapt what you're doing, both in the process of brewing and the marketing and your storefronts in terms of dealing with the pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about how you've been, what you've had to do to adapt to the atmosphere that we're in right now?
Yeah, so we're making a lot of hand sanitizer these days.
Yeah.
So it's a great way to supplement, not only supplement some of the revenue for the brewery, but also to help out and donate in areas where we can as well. But it's a process that it's kind of like the NA process for, making beer for Well-Being. We were set up as a brewery. And so it is a lot of hard work and effort to do something your facility isn't necessarily designed to do, but we all have to be creative, especially during with this pandemic and what's going on and sales dropping for everybody. So, for us, we jumped on hand sanitizer pretty quickly as something we could do to help supplement the labor and the work that we weren't getting from the beer side.
Derrick?
What was the question? We did make some hand sanitizer.
How are you adapting to the pandemic in terms of things you're having to change, cleanliness within your facilities? Obviously, the piece of the restaurant or the actual pub piece of it is something you're certainly is affecting things, I'm sure.
Right, of course. Yeah, so we have implemented all the city's requirements, hand sanitizer, our employees washing their hands all the time, and employees wearing masks because we have reopened our interior. We have a really large beer patio, a beer garden, though, that seats about 120 people. So we rearranged all the seats so that people can sit at least 6 feet apart, but most of the tables are at least 10 feet apart. One of the bummers, though, and I think Brian distributes a lot more beer than we do. The real bummer from this whole thing is that all of the restaurants and bars we service they're having a lot of problems. They're difficulties, you know. They're trying to reopen. They're trying to get things going, and it's just a tough period, man. I mean, everyone's trying to get things going back to normal, but you know, well, we're also worried about, you know, the virus and whatnot.
In addition to that, too, festivals. I mean, beer festivals have.
Oh boy.
There's nothing on the radar for those, which is really.
Those are dead. I mean, this is the first beer festival we've done since, I don't know, Urban Chestnut had their beer festival, Wolpertinger, in January, I think.
And that was
You were
about
there,
it.
Brian?
Yeah.
That was about the last one, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, I went to that one. It was nice, but it was like you hit the last thing.
Yeah.
I think
was it the Science Center one?
That may have happened just before.
That Science Center one at the Science Center?
Yeah.
Science on Tap. That was the Science on Tap, and so I think that just got in just ahead of it. But otherwise, things have been pretty much closed. I think one thing that's really evident, and both Brian and Derrick, you guys have spoke to this, and I see this across St. Louis. Our local craft brewers are doing a lot of really good work in the community. I mean, coming up and making hand sanitizer and being able to do that on the fly and pulling it off. And not only are you guys really good at going to the next beer and putting it on tap and designing things quickly, you can move on other things too. There's a lot of support in the community for festivals and things that are going on. And the beers you provide, they're great for food pairing and just doing things that are different. These are things that very worthy of our support. So I just wanted to thank you guys for that.
And with that, thank you. I want to, and I also want to thank you, Brian and Derrick, and I want to give you each a chance to just plug your breweries, where people can buy the product, and the locations where you're at, obviously, so that folks can see that. And we've got it on the screen here that your addresses. But talk a little bit about if people don't want to go to the store itself, where else they can find the beer. Go ahead, Derrick.
Yeah, so go ahead, Derrick. Yeah.
Oh, well, you can find our beer at smaller retailers like Randall's, Friar Tuck's, Hop Shop, and Craft Beer Cellar, Shaw Market, and Vincent's Market in Soulard. And you can find the tap room. We do most stuff in Growlers and Crowlers, and we're open limited hours. Check our website and Facebook and whatnot.
And Brian?
Yeah, so we're selling in all of the most of the retail outlets. The bars, like Derrick mentioned, bars are a little difficult, so draft sales are down. But as far as our bar, the O Bar at the brewery, we are also open limited hours. It's I believe it's Tuesday through Saturday, 4 to 8. So we have very limited hours compared to what we used to have. But we do conform to all of the rules and regs, which really gets our attendees or our customers down to about a third of what they used to be, but we now have some outdoor seating. We are also offering curbside pickup for packaged beer to go or draft beer to go, and we're selling the hand sanitizer on Facebook. So,
Brian, how many different beers in retail stores are you selling? How many different beers?
You know, it really depends on the store, but in the major grocery stores, the Schnucks and the Deerbergs, we usually have four to six facings on the shelf. In some of the other stores, we might have one or two. It just depends. But usually you'll find most of our core brands like 5 Day and Weech and our pretzel beer is out right now. And then you might see a seasonal scattered in here or there.
And what about you, Derrick? At the stores, the retail stores, how many beers do you have out there?
I think we have maybe 18, 20.
Great.
We focus mostly on smaller markets. We're not in Schnucks and we're not in Deerberg, because we self-distribute our beer and we can't get into these bigger markets unless we sign on with a distributor.
Got it. Well, thanks very much, Derrick, Brian, Bruce. Really appreciate you guys giving up an evening to talk about beer. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I certainly want to thank the UMSL Alumni Association that helped to organize this, along with the UMSL Events Group, and all of the folks at UMSL that did this. Cheers to you. Let's raise a glass for UMSL.
Cheers, guys.
Amazing job. Yep.
Cheers.
Look forward to I'm sure a lot of folks enrolling in your class after hearing about this, because it's fascinating stuff. So thanks.
I hope so.
This has been Edie from St. Louis Public Radio. It's been my pleasure to drink beer with these guys, And thanks for joining us, and we'll catch up with you soon.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Tim.
Tim.
Cheers.